When my millionaire grandfather passed away, I never expected to inherit a single dollar. He had a big family, and I was always the forgotten one, the kid my parents barely acknowledged. But when the will was read, he left me everything. My parents, who had ignored me my entire life, sued me to take it all back. When I walked into the courtroom, they rolled their eyes, but the judge froze. He said, "Wait, Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon, because what happened next shocked the entire courtroom and changed my life forever." My name is Joseph Montgomery, and for most of my life, I believed I was invisible. I grew up in a house filled with noise, clinking glasses, ringing phones, and the constant hum of business meetings, but not a single word of affection. My parents, Robert and Diane Montgomery, were wealthy, influential, and obsessed with appearances. They had everything, except the ability to love. They weren't cruel in the traditional sense. They didn't yell or hit me. They just didn't care. I was a prop, something they could use to complete the image of a perfect family. At school events, they stood in the back row, checking their phones. On my birthdays, they handed me envelopes of money, as if affection could be outsourced. I used to wonder if they even noticed when I was gone. There was only one person who ever made me feel like I mattered, my grandfather, Edward Montgomery. To the rest of the world, he was a respected businessman, a millionaire with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. But to me, he was simply Grandpa. He'd show up unannounced, wearing his old brown hat and smelling faintly of pipe tobacco. He used to tell me stories about how he built his fortune from nothing, not because he wanted to brag, but because he wanted me to learn something. Money, he'd say, is like a magnifying glass. It doesn't change who you are, it just shows it more clearly. When I was 14, I asked him why my parents didn't love me the way he did. He just smiled sadly and said, "They love the idea of having a son. They just don't know how to love you." Those words stuck with me for years. I went to college on a scholarship. My parents didn't help. I worked nights at a diner and lived in a small studio apartment, surviving on instant noodles and cheap coffee. Grandpa would call sometimes, just to ask if I was eating properly. He'd joke, "I'm not letting my grandson starve to death before he figures out what he's meant to do." And then one morning, 5 years after graduation, I got the call. "Mr. Montgomery," a formal voice said, "this is Anderson Law Firm. We regret to inform you that your grandfather, Edward Montgomery, passed away peacefully last night." I remember sitting in silence, staring at the peeling paint on my apartment wall. I didn't cry right away. It was like my body didn't know how. The world felt heavier, quieter. I'd lost the only person who had ever truly seen me. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail, a thick cream envelope sealed with the Montgomery family crest. Inside was an invitation to the reading of the will. The date, the location, the time, all neatly typed. I didn't even hear from my parents. Not a call, not a text. They didn't ask if I was coming. They didn't care that I'd lost the only real parent I ever had. When the day came, I drove 3 hours to the lawyer's office, a tall, old building with marble floors and polished wooden doors. My heart pounded as I walked in. My parents were already there, dressed in black designer clothes, looking like models for a grief-themed magazine cover. My mother's eyes flicked toward me for a split second, cold, dismissive, then back to her phone. The lawyer, Mr. Anderson, cleared his throat and began reading. He listed a few charitable donations, a few minor bequests to old friends. My parents straightened up when he got to their names. "To my son, Robert, and his wife, Diane, I leave," Mr. Anderson paused, "my old house in Maine, under the condition that it be maintained as a family heritage site." My mother's lips tightened. My father frowned. The house was beautiful, yes, but worth a fraction of Grandpa's fortune. Then Mr. Anderson looked at me. "To my grandson, Joseph Edward Montgomery," he said, glancing up with a small smile, "I leave the remainder of my estate, including all financial assets, business shares, and properties, totaling approximately $5 million. Silence. I froze. My hands trembled. I wasn't even sure I heard him right. My parents turned toward me in disbelief, my mother's face pale, my father's jaw tightening. The lawyer continued, "Along with this, a personal letter addressed to Joseph." He handed me an envelope. My name was written in Grandpa's neat cursive handwriting. I opened it slowly, my vision blurring as I read. Joseph, you learn to live without expecting anything. That's why I know you'll never let money own you. This inheritance isn't a reward, it's a responsibility. Do good with it. And remember, love is the only thing worth multiplying. Grandpa, I didn't even notice my parents storming out until the door slammed behind them. I sat there, clutching that letter, feeling a strange mix of grief and gratitude. I didn't care about the money. I would have traded every dollar for another conversation with him. But deep down, I knew this was going to change everything. Not because I was suddenly rich, but because my parents were never going to let it go. I walked out of that office feeling like I'd stepped into a storm I hadn't chosen. At that moment, I didn't realize that my inheritance wouldn't just reveal who my parents really were. It would also uncover something about myself that even I didn't know. People often say that money changes people. But in my family, money didn't change anyone. It revealed them. After Grandpa's death and the shocking will reading, I couldn't shake off one thought. Why did he trust me, and not his own son? To understand that, you'd have to know the story of how everything in our family fell apart long before I was even born. My father, Robert Montgomery, was Edward's only son. He grew up in privilege, private schools, lavish trips, every opportunity money could buy. Grandpa had built the Montgomery name from scratch, starting as a mechanic who fixed broken engines during the Great Depression. Through sheer grit and intelligence, he turned a small repair shop into one of the state's biggest manufacturing companies. But with success came distance. By the time my father was a teenager, Grandpa was rarely home. My grandmother, Lillian, managed the house, elegant, polite, but emotionally detached. She died when my father was 20. Grandpa tried to fill the void with business, and my father resented him for it. When my father eventually married my mother, Diane, he was determined to become everything Grandpa wasn't: present, successful, and respected. But his definition of success was twisted. It wasn't about building something meaningful. It was about status. My mother fit that world perfectly: beautiful, ambitious, and as cold as a diamond. I was born 2 years into their marriage, and according to Grandpa, that was when he started to worry. He told me once, when I was a teenager, that he'd gone to visit my parents at the hospital the day I was born. My mother wouldn't let him hold me. She said, "You've done enough controlling for one lifetime." Grandpa said he looked into the nursery through the glass, saw me sleeping, and made himself a silent promise. "If they won't love that boy, I will." I never knew how much those words would mean. As I grew up, my parents made sure to remind me that love was transactional. If I got straight A's, they'd take me to dinner. If I won a science fair, they'd mention me at cocktail parties. But if I made a mistake, any mistake, the house would turn silent, colder than winter air. Grandpa saw it all. Whenever he visited, he'd pull me aside. "Don't let their emptiness define you," he'd whisper. "You have something they don't: empathy." When I turned 16, he gave me a small wooden box. Inside was an old silver watch. "It doesn't work anymore," he said, "but I want you to keep it. It's a reminder that time is the only thing you can't buy back. Don't waste it chasing people who won't see you." At that time, I didn't understand the depth of what he meant. But looking back, it was the purest kind of wisdom, the kind that comes only from pain. My father always despised Grandpa's influence on me. I could tell. When Grandpa visited, my father's jaw would tighten. He'd pour himself another drink and mutter, "Dad's trying to make you his little project." But Grandpa didn't need to make me his project. He made me his student. He taught me to balance a checkbook, change a tire, negotiate fairly, and give more than I took. He taught me how to see people, not just numbers. When I went off to college, Grandpa helped with advice, but not money. "You'll value it more if you earn it," he said. And he was right. I worked double shifts at a diner, burned out countless nights, and learned how hard it was to stay hopeful when no one believed in you, except one person. After graduation, Grandpa and I had dinner together one last time before his health began to fail. He looked older, weaker, but his mind was sharp as ever. "Your father still hates me, you know," he said, half smiling. "He thinks I'm punishing him by leaving most of my company to charity." I asked, "Why did you?" He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Because I'd rather my money help strangers than destroy my family any further." That conversation haunted me after his death. It was like he already knew what would happen. He knew my parents would come for the money. He knew I'd have to face them alone. For a while, I tried to ignore the tension building around me. I focused on work, tried to honor his memory by keeping quiet. But as the weeks passed, my parents started sending messages through mutual acquaintances, subtle threats, legal inquiries, veiled insults. People would say things like, "Your mom mentioned she might challenge the will," or "Your dad's talking to some lawyers." I brushed it off, thinking they wouldn't go that far. But I underestimated just how much greed could replace love. In our family, it wasn't about who deserved it. It was about who couldn't stand to lose it. I still remember the last time I saw my parents before the lawsuit began. They invited me to dinner, the first time in years. The restaurant was expensive, the kind where the waiter refills your glass before you even realize it's half empty. My mother smiled through her teeth. "We just want to talk," she said. "We think there's been a misunderstanding." I knew immediately where it was going. They tried to convince me that Grandpa had been confused when he wrote the will, that I should do the right thing and share it equally. When I refused, my father's expression turned icy. "You're making a mistake, son," he said quietly. "That money doesn't belong to you." I replied, "Neither did your love." But I learned to live without it. The silence that followed was louder than any argument we'd ever had. I walked out that night knowing something inside me had finally broken, or maybe it had healed. I didn't know which yet, but I knew one thing for sure. That dinner was just the calm before the storm. The day of my grandfather's funeral was gray and heavy, as if the sky itself mourned him. The small New England town where he lived seemed to hold its breath. Autumn leaves whispered across the cobblestone path leading up to the old chapel. I stood outside for a moment before entering, clutching the small silver locket he had given me years ago, the only gift I'd ever received from family. Inside, the chapel was filled with familiar strangers, faces I hadn't seen in years. My parents sat in the front row, perfectly composed, dressed in black designer clothes that screamed wealth and vanity. My mother noticed me, but looked away instantly, as though my presence was a stain on the day. My father whispered something to her. She nodded without turning her head. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. My grandfather's mahogany casket gleamed beneath the dim light. The priest spoke of his generosity, his sharp mind, and his quiet strength. But as I listened, I realized nobody truly knew him like I did. Behind his tough, old-school exterior, Grandpa had been kind, witty, and full of life lessons disguised as sarcasm. He'd been the only person who saw me, who understood that I wasn't the failure my parents thought I was. After the ceremony, the family gathered in the large, wood-paneled study of Grandpa's mansion for the will reading. The air was thick with tension and unspoken greed. The lawyer, a thin, gray-haired man named Mr. Porter, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. As executor of the estate, I will now read the final will and testament of Mr. Harold Whitaker." My cousins leaned forward eagerly. My parents exchanged expectant glances. They had no idea what was coming. Mr. Porter began with the formalities, listing donations to charities and bequests to old friends. My name hadn't come up yet, and I felt invisible again. I told myself I expected nothing, but deep down, a small part of me hoped Grandpa had left me something, even just a note. Then Mr. Porter paused, looked directly at me, and said, "To my granddaughter, Evelyn Whitaker." The room went silent. Every eye turned toward me. Mr. Porter continued, "I leave the remainder of my estate, valued at approximately $5 million, including all properties, investments, and personal belongings." My mother gasped. My father slammed his palm on the table. "There must be some mistake," he barked. "She's barely part of this family." Mr. Porter shook his head calmly. Mr. Whitaker was quite clear. He also left a letter explaining his decision. He opened a sealed envelope and began to read aloud. "To my dear Evelyn, you were the only one who ever sat and listened to an old man ramble. You never asked for anything, yet you gave me the one thing nobody else did: respect. I hope this gift allows you to live freely, without fear or judgment. Don't let anyone convince you that you're unworthy. Love, Grandpa." Tears welled in my eyes. I covered my mouth to keep from crying out loud. My mother's face twisted in fury. My father's jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might crack. The cousins whispered among themselves. My aunt muttered something about favoritism, but I didn't care. For once in my life, I felt seen. After the will reading ended, I quietly left the mansion. My parents didn't speak to me, not that I expected them to. But as I drove home, I couldn't help but think that this wasn't the end of it. Knowing my parents, they wouldn't just let this go. And I was right. A week later, I received a thick envelope in the mail. It wasn't a letter of congratulations, it was a lawsuit. My parents were suing me, claiming that I had manipulated my grandfather into changing his will. They demanded the entire inheritance be revoked and redistributed to the rightful heirs. I remember sitting in my tiny apartment, holding that envelope with shaking hands. $5 million, or not. I felt like I was about to lose everything again. But something inside me had changed since the funeral. Grandpa had believed in me, and now I wasn't going to let them erase his last wish. So I hired a lawyer. Her name was Caroline Rhodes, and she was everything my parents weren't: ethical, intelligent, and compassionate. When I told her the story, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Evelyn, they're about to regret underestimating you." For the first time in my life, I felt like I had someone on my side. The court date was set for 2 months later. During that time, I learned more about my grandfather's past, his quiet defiance against my parents' arrogance, and, most shockingly, something about my own identity that would change everything. But that revelation wouldn't come until I walked into the courtroom, and the judge recognized me. The morning of the trial arrived with a chill that cut right through me. I stood outside the courthouse, watching my breath mist in the air, feeling both terrified and strangely empowered. My entire life had been shaped by people who told me I'd never amount to anything. But today, I wasn't the forgotten daughter anymore. I was the heir my grandfather had chosen. Caroline, my lawyer, walked beside me with calm confidence. "Remember," she said, adjusting her blazer, "the truth is on your side. They're loud, but you have facts. And facts win cases." Inside the courthouse, my parents were already seated with their attorney, a slick man in a $3,000 suit who oozed arrogance. My father shot me a look filled with disdain. My mother smirked, whispering something under her breath. I could tell they thought this was already won. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. He was a tall man in his 60s, stern but not unkind. "Court is now in session," he said. "We're here to address the matter of Whitaker versus Whitaker, contesting the will of the late Harold Whitaker." My heart pounded. The name echoed like a thunderclap. This wasn't just about money. It was about proving that I belonged, that I wasn't the outcast my parents painted me to be. Their lawyer went first. He stood, smoothing his tie. "Your Honor, the defendants, Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker, believe the will was altered under undue influence. The granddaughter, Evelyn, reconnected with her grandfather only in his final months, and somehow walked away with the majority of the estate. We suspect manipulation." Caroline rose calmly. "Objection, Your Honor. That's pure speculation. We have evidence that Mr. Whitaker had his mental faculties fully intact. His physician's notes confirm he was of sound mind when he updated his will." The judge nodded. "Objection sustained. Proceed with evidence, Ms. Rhodes." Over the next few days, I watched as my life was dissected piece by piece. My parents' lawyer presented photos of me and Grandpa together, implying that I'd infiltrated his life for money. They even brought in a handwriting expert to claim the signature on the will looked different. But Caroline countered every accusation with surgical precision. She presented videos of me visiting Grandpa months before his illness worsened, proof of our correspondence, letters where he thanked me for spending time with him, and even emails where he said, "I'm proud of the woman you've become." Every time Caroline spoke, my parents' confidence cracked a little more. Then came the moment that shifted everything. The judge turned to me. "Miss Whitaker, please take the stand." I walked up, swearing in with trembling hands. My father watched me with cold amusement. My mother didn't even try to hide her contempt. Caroline began softly. "Evelyn, can you tell the court about your relationship with your grandfather?" I nodded. "Yes. He was the only person who ever really treated me like family. When I was a kid, my parents sent me to boarding school after my 10th birthday. I rarely saw them. But Grandpa, he'd visit. He'd bring me books, write letters, ask how I was doing in class. When I got older, he told me stories about his childhood, about how he built his business from nothing. He said he saw himself in me." Caroline smiled gently. "Did your grandfather ever mention his intentions regarding the will?" "Yes," I said, my voice steadying. "He told me he didn't want his legacy in the hands of people who only cared about appearances. He wanted his fortune to go to someone who would use it wisely." My father scoffed loudly. "You expect us to believe that?" The judge shot him a warning look. Mr. Whitaker, control yourself. When my father finally sat back down, I continued. He said I reminded him of his sister, Eleanor. She ran away from the family because of how they treated her. I didn't know much about her, but he said she was brave, independent. He said she had a heart like mine. The judge's brow furrowed slightly at that name, but he said nothing yet. Caroline handed me a photo. Is this the letter your grandfather wrote before his passing? I nodded, tears prickling my eyes. Yes, that's his handwriting, and that's his voice in every word. Caroline turned to the judge. Your Honor, we'd like to submit the original letter for evidence, alongside the verification of the signature from Mr. Whitaker's attorney of record. The judge examined the documents carefully. Accepted. When my testimony ended, I felt drained, but free. My parents, however, were livid. Their lawyer stood and said, Your Honor, we'd like to call our next witness, the family's longtime accountant, Mr. Langford. As Mr. Langford took the stand, I felt uneasy. He'd been my father's friend for years. But to my surprise, his words didn't go the way they'd hoped. I managed Mr. Whitaker's accounts for nearly 4 decades, he said, glancing briefly at me. He was meticulous about everything. And yes, I can confirm, he changed his will 6 months before his passing, entirely of his own volition. He said he had finally decided who truly deserved it. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. My mother's face turned white. The judge raised an eyebrow. That's quite the statement, Mr. Langford. He nodded. Yes, Your Honor. He told me he wanted Evelyn to have everything because she was, well, he hesitated. Because she was the only one who carried the Whitaker bloodline forward. Silence. My father's face twisted. What the hell does that mean? He snapped. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Langford, please clarify. Langford swallowed. Mr. Whitaker confided in me years ago that there were family secrets. Things not even his children knew. I don't know the details, but he often said, when the time comes, they'll understand who she really is. My heart thudded in my chest. Who she really is. The judge looked intrigued. I see. Thank you, Mr. Langford. You may step down. When the session adjourned for the day, Caroline looked at me, her eyes full of curiosity. Evelyn, I think your grandfather was trying to tell you something. And I don't think it's just about inheritance. I nodded slowly, still reeling from what had been said. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I reread Grandpa's letter again. The words, "You remind me of Eleanor," echoed in my mind. Who was Eleanor really? And why did the judge react when I mentioned her name? I didn't know it yet, but the truth was about to explode in court, and it would shake my parents to their core. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras flashing as soon as I walked in. Somehow, word had spread that the case between the Whitaker family had taken an unexpected turn. My parents avoided my gaze, whispering furiously to their lawyer, while I sat beside Caroline, trying to keep my breathing steady. The judge entered, his expression unreadable, but I noticed it immediately. He looked directly at me before sitting down, almost as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. Court is now back in session, he said. Let's proceed. My parents' lawyer, Mr. Daniels, stood first. Your Honor, before we continue, we'd like to present new evidence that may shed light on the legitimacy of the will. He turned dramatically toward the audience. We have located a witness who claims to have seen Ms. Evelyn Whitaker visiting Mr. Harold Whitaker under questionable circumstances. Caroline frowned. What kind of circumstances? Daniel smiled. We'll let her tell the story. The bailiff opened the door, and my stomach dropped when I saw who walked in. Margaret, my parents' former housekeeper. She looked nervous, clutching her purse. Daniels guided her to the stand. Mrs. Preston, please tell the court what you saw. She hesitated. I used to work for Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker years ago. One afternoon, I was dropping off some papers for them at Mr. Harold's estate. I saw Evelyn there, and they were arguing. Loudly, Daniels leaned in. And what did you hear? She said something like, "You owe me this." And he said, "It's not about owing, it's about blood." That's all I heard before I left. My parents exchanged smug smiles, like they'd won. Daniels turned to the judge. See? Even the beneficiary admitted to demanding something from the deceased. That alone proves manipulation. Caroline stood up, calm and composed. Mrs. Preston, you said this was months before Mr. Whitaker's death? Yes, ma'am. Caroline nodded. Then you must also remember that around that time, Mr. Whitaker had recently undergone heart surgery. Do you recall that? The woman blinked. Ah, yes. Do you also recall that Evelyn was his emergency contact, not his son or daughter? Silence fell. Mrs. Preston looked at me, surprised. Caroline continued, her voice sharp as glass. Because I have hospital records right here showing that when Mr. Whitaker was admitted, Evelyn signed every paper. She handled his medications, his care, his home. You call that manipulation? That's called love. The gallery murmured. The judge raised his hand for silence. Point noted, Ms. Rhodes. Continue. Caroline sat, shooting me a reassuring glance. But I could see something still bothered the judge, something he hadn't said yet. Hours passed as witnesses came and went. Bankers, nurses, even my grandfather's lawyer. All confirmed the same thing. He was in full control when he changed his will. Still, my parents looked confident. It was as if they had a final card to play. Finally, Daniel stood for his closing argument. Your Honor, he began, this case isn't just about a will, it's about deception. My clients spent their lives building the Whitaker name, and now, someone who barely knew the deceased stands to destroy it. We believe that a fraud has been committed, and until we uncover who this young woman truly is, justice cannot be served. He turned toward me, his voice dripping with accusation. Because frankly, Your Honor, there are inconsistencies even in her birth records. The judge froze. Her birth records? Yes, Your Honor, Daniel said smoothly. We've discovered that Evelyn's birth certificate was altered 25 years ago. The file was sealed shortly after. Would you like to see? Caroline shot up. Objection. That's irrelevant to the will. But the judge interrupted, his tone suddenly grave. No, Ms. Rhodes. I'd like to see it. Daniels handed over the document. The judge's face shifted as he read. His eyes moved from the paper to me, then back again. His hand trembled slightly. He whispered, barely audible, Wait, this can't be right. My stomach twisted. What is it, Your Honor? He looked at me, his voice hushed but full of shock. Your full name. Evelyn Eleanor Whitaker. Yes, I said slowly. He blinked hard, as if struggling to process something. I knew Eleanor Whitaker. She was my mother's sister. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Caroline turned to me, stunned. What? The judge leaned forward, disbelief written across his face. Eleanor disappeared decades ago. My mother said she ran off after a scandal with the Whitaker family. Nobody ever found her. But if you're her granddaughter. He trailed off, realizing the weight of what he was saying. Daniel's confidence faltered for the first time. My parents sat in stunned silence, color draining from their faces. The judge cleared his throat, composing himself. Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have uncovered a far deeper connection than anyone anticipated. I need to review this privately. Court will recess for 30 minutes. The gavel hit the desk, echoing through the stunned silence. As people began murmuring and standing, my father shot up. This is ridiculous. She's lying. She can't be related to him. But the judge ignored him and left the room, still holding the birth record in his hand. Caroline turned to me, eyes wide. Evelyn, if that's true, if you're Eleanor's granddaughter, that changes everything. I sat there, frozen, as memories of Grandpa's words echoed in my head. You remind me of Eleanor. You have her spirit. Now it all made sense. He hadn't just seen me as his granddaughter by name. He'd known the truth. That I was the bloodline his own children had tried to erase. When court resumed, I could feel the tension in the air. The judge's expression was different now, not just serious, but personal. He looked straight at my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker, he began slowly. It appears your father may have had reasons for his decisions that you could never have understood. The will stands. Evelyn Whitaker inherits the estate in full. My mother gasped. No, you can't do this. The judge's voice hardened. I can, and I will. Because this young woman isn't just your father's heir. She's the living proof of a truth your family buried decades ago. My father slammed his fist against the table. This is madness. The judge stood, eyes sharp. No, Mr. Whitaker. This is justice. The courtroom erupted into whispers. My parents sat back, defeated. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel forgotten. I felt seen. The truth about my heritage had done more than win me a fortune. It had rewritten who I was. And as I left the courthouse that day, I realized something deeper. Grandpa hadn't just left me his money. He'd left me his story, and that story had finally been told. The gavel's echo still lingered in the air when the crowd began to disperse. I sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, the weight of everything pressing on my chest. My parents stormed out, their lawyer trailing behind, muttering something about an appeal that everyone knew would never happen. But as the tension thinned, the judge remained seated, staring down at the document in his hand, my birth record, still trembling slightly between his fingers. "Miss Whitaker," he said finally, his voice softer now, "I want to see you in my chambers before you leave." Caroline squeezed my shoulder reassuringly. "Don't worry, Evelyn. This isn't bad, not after that ruling." Still, I felt my pulse racing as I followed him down the narrow hallway to his private office. The judge, Judge Harris, I now realized, shut the door behind us and gestured for me to sit. "I owe you an explanation," he began, "and an apology for reacting the way I did earlier." "You were surprised?" I said carefully. "I was too." He nodded. "Yes, but there's more to it. When I saw your full name, something inside me clicked. My mother, Margaret Harris, she was Eleanor Whitaker's sister. That makes me your distant cousin, I suppose." I blinked. "You're saying my great-aunt was your mother?" He smiled faintly. "Yes, but there's more. Eleanor was disowned by the Whitakers after she married a man they didn't approve of, a factory worker, not for money. She vanished soon after. The family claimed she died abroad. But your grandfather, he must have known the truth." I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. He knew who I was all along. Judge Harris leaned forward. "I believe so, and I think he wanted to make sure the truth came out, not just through the will, but through something else." He pulled out a sealed envelope from a manila folder. "When your grandfather's estate lawyer sent me this, it was labeled to be opened only if the inheritance was contested in court. He must have predicted this would happen." He handed it to me. "Go ahead." With trembling fingers, I broke the seal. Inside was a letter written in my grandfather's sharp, elegant handwriting. "My dear Evelyn, if you're reading this, then your parents have done exactly what I expected, tried to take what was never theirs. I need you to know the full truth before you move forward. You are not just my granddaughter. You are the granddaughter of my beloved sister, Eleanor. She was the only member of this family who ever understood what it meant to have a heart. Your mother and father drove her away, just as they tried to drive you away. When I discovered who you were, I saw it as fate's way of giving our family a second chance. That's why I left you everything. Not for money, but for redemption. Inside my safe at the estate, there's a small box labeled Eleanor. It holds the proof of who you are, her letters, her photos, her locket. Keep them safe. Keep her story alive. Because one day, you'll understand that our family's true wealth isn't what sits in a bank. It's what survives in the truth we dare to tell. With love, Grandpa Harold." By the time I finished reading, my eyes were wet. Judge Harris sat silently, giving me space to breathe. "That letter," he said after a moment, "is the real verdict. The court could only confirm what your grandfather already knew. He didn't just pass on money, he passed on legacy." I nodded slowly, feeling a strange calm settle over me. He wanted me to uncover the truth myself. "Exactly," Harris said. "And Evelyn, don't underestimate what that means. Your story could change how people remember him." And Eleanor. Caroline entered quietly, her face softening when she saw the tears in my eyes. "Are you okay?" I smiled weakly. "Yeah, for the first time, I think I am." Outside, the late afternoon light spilled across the courthouse steps. The reporters swarmed, but I barely noticed. I felt like I was walking on air, lighter, freer, as though the years of silence and neglect had finally burned away. Caroline walked beside me, clutching her briefcase. "You know," she said, "there's still something in that estate we haven't checked yet." His lawyer mentioned a safe in his old study. I remembered the line from the letter. Yeah, the one labeled Eleanor. When we reached the Whitaker estate that evening, the once grand mansion felt haunted, echoes of my childhood footsteps bouncing off marble floors. The staff had long since left. It was just us and the smell of old books and dust. In my grandfather's study, sunlight streamed across the old oak desk. And there it was, a small brass safe built into the wall behind a faded portrait of him and Eleanor. The combination came easily, my birthday. I turned the lock and pulled the door open. Inside was a small velvet box. When I opened it, I found letters, fragile and yellowed with age, and a gold locket. Inside the locket was a picture of a young woman holding a baby. I gasped. That's her, and that's me. Caroline leaned closer. He must have kept that photo all these years. There was another note tucked beneath the locket. It read, "To my granddaughter, the light that returned after years of darkness. Use what I've left you not to build walls, but bridges." I held the locket tightly, feeling its warmth in my palm. For the first time, I didn't feel angry at my parents anymore. I just felt pity. They'd spent their lives chasing wealth, and in doing so, lost the only thing that ever truly mattered, connection. As I looked around that quiet study, surrounded by my grandfather's books, his cigar scent still faintly in the air, I realized that I had inherited something far greater than a fortune. I had inherited the truth. The next day, I met with Judge Harris one last time to finalize the estate documents. When we finished, he shook my hand warmly. "Take care of yourself, Evelyn," he said. "Your grandfather was right to trust you." I smiled. "Thank you, Judge Harris, for everything, especially for helping me understand who I really am." As I left his office, I could still hear his voice behind me. Sometimes justice doesn't come from the law, but from the courage to face what others refuse to see. That sentence stayed with me, because he was right. This wasn't just about inheritance or revenge. It was about reclaiming my identity from the people who tried to erase it. And in that quiet victory, I knew my story, our story, was far from over. When the judge returned to the bench after what felt like an eternity of deliberation, the entire courtroom fell silent. My parents sat stiffly, their eyes darting between each other like cornered animals. My lawyer placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, but my pulse was hammering so hard it drowned out everything else. Then Judge Rowan cleared his throat and said the words that changed my life forever. After reviewing the will, the estate records, and the evidence provided by both parties, I find in favor of the defendant, Mr. Ethan Moore. The courtroom gasped. My mother's mouth fell open. My father slammed his palm on the table in disbelief. But the judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, "based on the documentation and the late Mr. Harold Moore's explicit instructions, the inheritance of $8 million remains solely under Mr. Ethan Moore's ownership. The plaintiff's claim is dismissed with prejudice." For a second, I couldn't breathe. I wasn't just relieved, I was vindicated. The judge looked at me again, his expression softening. "Mr. Moore," he said, "I want to thank you for your patience during this process. And I must also tell you something that, well, I didn't expect to find myself saying today." He opened a thin envelope on the bench and held up a small, faded photograph. "Your grandfather left me this, years ago. He asked me to keep it safe until a young man named Ethan Moore would one day stand before me." The courtroom murmured in confusion. The judge turned the photo toward me. It was my grandfather, younger, standing proudly beside a little boy. Me. I remembered that day. I was maybe 4, sitting on his knee, holding a model airplane. On the back, written in my grandfather's bold handwriting, were the words, "If he ever stands in your court, remember, he's not just my heir, he's my legacy." The judge looked up, visibly emotional. "I served with your grandfather in the army. He saved my life once. I promised him I'd protect what mattered most to him, his grandson." A ripple of stunned silence swept across the courtroom. My parents were speechless, their eyes wide and wet. My father tried to say something, but no words came out. The judge turned his gaze to them. "Mr. and Mrs. Moore, I hope this serves as a reminder. Money can be earned and lost, but family? Once you throw it away, you might never get it back." He struck his gavel once. Case dismissed. The sound echoed through the courtroom, sealing everything. As I stood, I caught my parents' eyes one last time. There was no triumph in me, only closure. I had spent years chasing the approval they'd never give. Now, I didn't need it anymore. My grandfather's love had been enough, and now everyone knew it. Outside, the air felt lighter. My lawyer clapped me on the back and said, "Your grandfather would be proud." I smiled faintly. He already was. The next morning, I visited my grandfather's grave. I placed that old photograph on the headstone and whispered, "You kept your promise, Grandpa." And I kept mine. Then I walked away, finally free. What would you have done if your parents tried to take away something your loved one left for you? Would you forgive them, or walk away for good? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life stories like this one. Thank you for watching. And as always, may your heart stay strong, your spirit stay kind, and your story keep unfolding beautifully. See you in the next video.